Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're a monk in a stone monastery somewhere in Europe more than 1,500 years ago. Outside your narrow window it is daytime, but the light feels wrong. The sun is there, yet it looks pale, like it is struggling. The air is cold, even though the calendar says it should be summer. You dip your quill into ink and hesitate. Do you write this down, or do you tell yourself the world has always been this way? Because here is the chilling truth: one of the worst global catastrophes in human history did not arrive with fire armies or a single dramatic date. It slipped quietly into medieval records hidden between prayers, crop reports, and notes about the weather. Most people today have never heard of it, and yet it changed the world. Before we step deeper into this forgotten apocalypse, let me gently ask you something. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful stories like this one, the kind you can listen to while resting or drifting towards sleep, consider staying with this channel. A simple, like a quiet subscription or a small comment, really helps these stories find the people who need them. And if you feel like sharing, where are you listening from right now? Nighttime in America, early morning somewhere else? I would love to know. Now get comfortable, let the room stay calm, and let us begin. The story starts not with chaos, but with confusion. In the early medieval world, monks, priests, and scholars were careful observers. They recorded eclipses, comets, strange storms, and good harvests. They believed history was a conversation between humanity and God, so nothing unusual felt too small to write down. Then suddenly, across records from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, the same unsettling detail appears. The sun stopped shining properly. A Roman historian named Procopius, writing around the year 536, described a sun that gave off light without brightness, like a permanent eclipse. In Syria, chroniclers wrote of a dim haze that lingered for months. In China, official records mention frosts and snow falling during summer seasons. These writers did not know each other. They lived thousands of miles apart. But their words quietly echo the same fear. Something was wrong with the sky. At the time, people blamed divine anger, bad omens, or the end of days. But modern scientists reading these medieval notes alongside ice core samples from Greenland have found something remarkable. Layers of volcanic ash dated precisely to this period suggest massive eruptions had filled the atmosphere with dust-blocking sunlight across much of the planet. No explosion was heard in Europe. No warning reached the monasteries. Only the cold arrived. And as the light faded, so did certainty. Crops struggled. Seasons felt unreliable. People began to sense that the world they understood was quietly shifting beneath their feet. In the next part of our journey, we'll follow what happened when sunlight failed, temperatures dropped, and an entire generation faced hunger without knowing why. And as the candlelight of our story steadies, the world quietly shifts from whispered warnings to written fear. Because medieval people didn't have satellites or thermometers, but they had something just as revealing: monks with ink-stained fingers and a habit of writing down everything that went wrong. In the early 14th century, those pens began to scratch the same sentence again and again across Europe: the rain would not stop. In the year 1315, spring arrived soaked and cold. Seeds rotted in the fields. Wheat sprouted, then drowned. Cows collapsed in muddy pastures. In England, a chronicler named Henry Knighton wrote that the earth did not yield her fruits, a polite medieval way of saying people were beginning to starve. This was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a disaster so vast that modern historians estimate up to 15% of Northern Europe's population died. Imagine that for a moment. Not a single dramatic explosion. Not one invading army. Just rain, cold, and hunger day after day, quietly emptying villages. Records from France tell us bread prices quadrupled. In some regions, parents abandoned children because they could no longer feed them. Church courts, usually busy with marriage disputes, suddenly filled with cases of theft, involving turnips, crusts of bread, even animal feed. One chilling note from a monastery in Flanders mentions people eating seed grain meant for the next year, which is like burning your furniture to stay warm. knowing tomorrow will be colder. And here is where medieval records become almost uncomfortable to read. Chroniclers begin to hint at things they do not want to describe directly. The annals of St. Mary's Abbey speak of unspeakable acts driven by hunger. Historians today agree this likely refers to cannibalism, something so horrifying that scribes could not bring themselves to spell it out. What makes this apocalypse forgotten is not its scale, but its subtlety. There is no single date to remember, no famous battle name, just a slow collapse of trust in the natural order. When bread fails, faith trembles. When seasons break their promises, people start to believe the world itself is sick. Here is a question for you, just quietly, wherever you're listening from. If the grocery stores closed for a month, what would happen to the stories we tell ourselves about stability and safety? Medieval people were not weaker than us. They were simply more exposed. And just when Europe thought the worst had passed, something even darker was already moving beneath the surface. Because famine weakens bodies, but it also opens the door for something far more merciless. And that is where the ink in medieval records turns from grey to almost black as we step into the shadow of the next catastrophe. What followed did not arrive with thunder or warning bells. It slipped in quietly, carried by ships, by fleas, by breath itself. By the time medieval people realised something new was happening, it was already everywhere. In the year 1347, strange deaths were reported in the ports of the Mediterranean. Sailors collapsed after a few days of fever. Black swellings appeared in the groin and under the arms. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio observed that healthy people ate breakfast with friends and were dead by nightfall. He wrote these words not as poetry, but as testimony, trying to make sense of a world unraveling in real time. This was the Black Death, and medieval records describe it with a kind of stunned disbelief. Parish rolls from England show entire families disappearing between one line and the next. In some villages, priests died so quickly that no one remained to record the deaths at all. Modern estimates suggest that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population vanished within a few years. Imagine every second or third person you know simply gone. What makes this apocalypse especially haunting is how carefully it was written down. Not in dramatic speeches, but in margins. A tax record ends early. A monastery chronicle stops mid-sentence. One scribe in Siena added a final note, "I am sick and cannot finish this." There is no ending after that. People searched desperately for meaning. Some blamed poisoned wells. Others blamed the stars. A few blamed cats, which only made things worse because fewer cats meant more rats. Dark humour did exist even then. A joke from the period says that doctors became rich because they never cured anyone long enough to complain. Laughter, it seems, has always been a survival tool. Pause for a moment and ask yourself this. If you lived in a world where tomorrow was never promised, how would that change the way you loved, prayed, or forgave medieval people were forced to answer that question every single day? And yet, even after death reshaped cities and emptied streets, something quietly remarkable began to stir. Out of loss came adaptation, new thinking, and unexpected resilience. And that is where the records surprisingly begin to whisper, not only of endings, but of transformation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world that survived began to look very different from the one that had collapsed. The plague did not just take lives. It rearranged society in ways medieval people never planned and never fully understood at the time. With so many workers gone, fields sat empty, workshops fell silent, and suddenly labour had value in a way it never had before. In England, surviving farm workers began demanding wages instead of lifelong servitude. Landowners panicked. In the year 1349, wages rose sharply across Europe. Governments tried to stop it. England even passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It did not work. When half the workforce disappears, laws cannot argue with reality. Women too quietly stepped into new roles. Guild records from cities like Paris and Cologne show widows running businesses once reserved for men. Not because society suddenly became progressive, but because survival demanded flexibility. History rarely changes through speeches. It changes through necessity. Faith also shifted. Some people became more devout, clinging to prayer as a lifeline. Others felt betrayed. Church records show declining donations in certain regions after the plague, alongside the rise of private devotion at home. When institutions fail during crisis, people search for meaning elsewhere. Does that sound familiar to you? Even medicine took hesitant steps forward. Medieval doctors were wrong about many things, but the sheer scale of death forced observation. Quarantine practices appeared in Italian city-states like Venice, where ships were isolated for 40 days. That is where the word quarantine comes from. 40 days of waiting, hoping, watching. What fascinates historians is this. Out of unimaginable loss came the seeds of the modern world. Stronger wages, shifting social classes, new ideas about health and responsibility. The apocalypse was not just an ending, it was a turning point. And as we move closer to the final moments of this story, one quiet question remains. Why did so many people, even centuries later, seem to forget just how close the world once came to complete collapse? Not everyone experienced the aftermath in the same way. Beyond laws and wages, something quieter and more unsettling spread through medieval Europe collective trauma. People did not have a word for it, but they lived inside it every day. Chroniclers described a world where laughter felt inappropriate and long silences became normal. Art from the late 14th century tells this story without using words. Suddenly skeletons danced with kings in murals known as the Danse Macabre. Death was no longer hidden behind church walls. It stood in the town square holding hands with everyone rich or poor. If you walked into a chapel after the plague, you were not meant to feel comforted. You were meant to remember. Memory itself became selective. Some communities recorded the catastrophe in painful detail. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio described empty streets and parents abandoning children not out of cruelty but terror. Yet in other regions, official records went strangely quiet. Taxes resumed. Names disappeared from lists replaced by new ones. It was as if society collectively decided that silence was easier than remembrance. Fear also needed someone to blame. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells despite clear evidence that the plague struck indiscriminately. In Strasbourg, in the year 1349 hundreds were killed in a single day. It was not logic guiding these acts, but panic. History shows us again and again that when understanding fails, fear looks for a face. And yet even in the darkness, humour survived. Some surviving letters joke grimly about inheritance arriving faster than expected. It is uncomfortable but deeply human. When reality becomes unbearable, the mind looks for relief wherever it can find it. So here we are standing between memory and forgetting. The world rebuilt itself, but it never fully processed what it endured. And that unfinished emotional reckoning leads us directly into the final question of this story, how forgetting shaped the future that followed. And so slowly, almost quietly, Europe moved on. Fields were planted again. Bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. Children were born who had never seen the world before the plague. Within 2 or 3 generations, the catastrophe that killed nearly 1/3 of the population faded into something strangely distant. Not denied, but softened. Not erased, but blurred. This forgetting shaped the future more than we often realize. Without fully understanding why the plague happened, medieval society rebuilt on the same foundations. Cities grew dense again. Animals and humans shared tight spaces. Waste systems improved only slightly. The belief that disease came from bad air or divine punishment remained dominant for centuries. Even in the year 1600, doctors still carried perfumed masks, hoping sweet smells would protect them from death. Yet hidden inside the tragedy were quiet beginnings of modern thinking. After repeated outbreaks, some cities experimented with quarantine. Venice in the 15th century required ships to wait 40 days before docking. That is where the word quarantine comes from. 40 days. Not perfect science, but a crucial step toward public health. The plague also forced people to question authority. When prayers failed and doctors fled, ordinary people began to rely on observation and experience. This shift did not happen overnight, but historians often point to the aftermath of the Black Death as one of the long roots of the Renaissance. When everything familiar collapses, curiosity finds room to grow. There is something deeply human here. We forget disasters not because they are unimportant, but because remembering forever would paralyze us. Forgetting is a survival skill, but forgetting too much means repeating the same mistakes. Medieval records whisper this warning to us across time, so as you lie here listening, maybe ask yourself a gentle question. If someone centuries from now reads our records, what will they say we understood? And what will they say we chose not to see? The forgotten apocalypse was never truly gone. It lived quietly in laws, in habits, in fears passed down like family stories with missing pages. And tonight, by remembering it together, we give those silent voices a little space to breathe again. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with me, and for listening so carefully. If you enjoyed drifting through history tonight, stay close. Another story is already waiting to be told.